Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more Automation the Car Company Tycoon game. Continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison Car Company in 2011. And the model we're going to be looking at in this video is the Edison Nebula, which is our SUV. So hopping into the base trim here. Let's start off by taking a look at the body and chassis setup. So the chassis is a monocoque chassis made out of AHS steel, front transverse engine placement, McPherson strut up front, and semi-trailing arm in the rear. And we have partial aluminum for the panel material to keep that weight down a little bit. For the overall styling, I went with this nice silver color here, which is pretty popular color in the 2000s era. And for the body that I went with the same body we used for the Asteroid, as I discussed in that video. So these two variants of this body I used for the Asteroid, and this one over here we're using for the Nebula. This base trim is a transverse front-wheel drive type, and the engine we're going to be using is the same engine we've used in the Star, the Orbit, the Asteroid, and now the Nebula. So it's the EV 3.211 with the BNA 6 variant of that engine. And just as a reminder of its performance, it produces 246 horsepower and 209 foot-pounds of torque. Hopping into the trim setup, we have a 6-speed automatic with the 5th and 6th gear going beyond the estimated top speed for increased fuel economy. The fuel economy we get is 20.9 miles per gallon and our 0 to 62 time of 8.3 seconds. We do have a little bit of wheel spin at 8.8%, and for the differential, we're using a viscous LSD. For the tire choice, we have medium compound road, 18-inch rims, 245 width in both front and rear, and steel rim material. For the brakes, we have solid disc 3-piston up front and solid disc 1-piston in the rear, and we have a reduced size brake in the rear to try and reduce some of that lockup by over braking. For the aerodynamics, we have a fully clad under tray, and the cooling airflow comes in around 20 above required cooling, which is more than I typically do, but this is for increased reliability, mirroring the same kind of setup I use for the Asteroid. For the interior setup, we have 8 seats, standard interior, standard CD, and power steering, ABS, traction control, and electronic stability control, all as standard. Again, for the same reasons I mentioned in my first couple videos for this year period, and standard safety. For the suspension setup, I have standard springs, gas monotube dampers, and passive sway bars, and this is my overall suspension setup. Hopping onto the test track here, we have a top speed of 128.3 miles an hour. Weight comes in at 4,100 pounds, a little bit more than that. Weight distribution is a little front heavy, but this is a front engine, front wheel drive layout, so that's not too surprising. Core energy is not too bad for an SUV. I don't expect this to be too bad. Decent top speed, decent acceleration. We end up with 1 minute 35.78. Hopping into the next trim, we have the standard trim with the addition of all-wheel drive. So drive type is now transverse all-wheel drive, but we're using the same engine as we did with our other standard trim, and most of the setup should be roughly the same. We're now using a 60-40 power distribution, which is going to reduce wheel spin down quite a bit. Fuel economy is at 20.5 miles per gallon, and 0 to 62 time is now increased to 8.5 seconds. Tire setup remains the same, as does the brake setup, although we do have slightly bigger brakes in the rear, as we do have more weight to contend with. The aerodynamics remain the same as well, as does the interior setup. Suspension might be slightly different because of difference in weight. And hopping onto the test track, we have a top speed of 126.6 miles an hour. Weight is now up to almost 4,400 pounds. We're not quite as front heavy, though, because of the addition of the all-wheel drive setup. Cornering trees look like they've taken a little bit of a hit. So I can expect this to overall be a little bit slower than our previous trim. And that is indeed the case. We lost more than a second there. And now we are going to be hopping into a EcoBoost engined version. So this is going to be using the turbocharged EcoBoost engine, which we showcased with the Orbit and the Asteroid. But just as a reminder, it produces 302 horsepower and 302 foot-pounds of torque. As far as the gearbox setup goes, this is again a 6-speed automatic with the 5th and 6th gear going beyond that estimated top speed. The end result of that is a 0 to 62 time of 6.8 seconds and a fuel economy of 21 miles per gallon. So you'll note that this is an improvement over our previous all-wheel drive trim that we looked at with the standard V6, both in fuel economy slightly and 0 to 62 time pretty dramatically. But we do have more wheel spin to contend with at 6.4%. Tire setup remains the same, but we do have the addition of a vented disc brake to bring down that brake fade to pretty much non-existent levels. Cooling airflow is going to go up as this is a more powerful engine. Oh, and we also have the addition of cooling flaps to increase that fuel economy. Interior remains the same. This is still a standard trim, just with the EcoBoost engine. Suspension might be slightly changed, although I don't think it's all that different from the other all-wheel drive trim. Hopping into the test track here, our top speed has now gone up to 134.7 miles an hour. Weight is a little over 4,500 pounds. It looks like we're a little bit more front heavy as we have more weight up front with that engine. Cornering G's has taken a little bit of a hit as well. But I expect this overall to be faster as top speed and acceleration have improved. And that is indeed the case with 1 minute 34.09. The last trim we're going to look at is a premium trim, but this uses the standard V6, not the turbocharged V6. There is no V8 variant this year. I view the EcoBoost engine as an adequate replacement for the V8 we've used in the past for the Nebula, although you do have quite a bit of a penalty to drivability with the turbocharged engine. Now, this does use the Constellation variant of this engine. So, just as a reminder, this produces 252 horsepower and 214 foot-pounds of torque, slight improvement over the base EV 3.2 11 engine. And a big reason why I chose this engine is because of the exhaust setup. This has 2 reverse flow mufflers, which is going to bring the noise down, which is going to help for comfort. And this being the premium trim, I thought that was a good idea. In any case, let's go ahead and take a look at the setup. So again, this is a 6-speed automatic set up with that 5th and 6th gear going again beyond the estimated top speed. The end result of that is fuel economy of 20.4 miles per gallon and a 0 to 62 time of 8.6 seconds. We have a little bit of wheel spin at 2. And considering that we've added a lot of weight on with the premium interior and entertainment system that has been added in here, that's actually not too much of a drop-off of our other all-wheel drive trims. Tire setup remains the same except the addition of alloy rims, which use this style of rim. Brakes also are the same with the addition of the vented disc, bringing down that brake fade over a couple of other trims. The cooling airflow does need to be brought up a little bit over the base EV 3.2 because of that increased power. The interior now has a premium interior and premium infotainment system. Otherwise, suspension is about the same as we've seen in the past. And hopping into the test track, our top speed is 127.2 miles an hour. Weight comes in at a little over 4,500 pounds, close to 4,600 pounds. Weight distribution is pretty even now. Cornering G's are not too bad. And I don't expect this to be too slow of a performance. It's definitely not going to be as good as the turbocharged engine, though, that we just ran. So the time is 1 minute 37.67. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the project setup. So this is, again, very similar to the setup I usually do. And again, the focus is at 50 because we are using some higher tech features here. So I kind of kept it in the middle, even though this would be still a somewhat high production vehicle. As far as the factory setup goes, I have a large factory. Shifts are set at 2, automation at 80. And as far as setting up which trim I thought would be the most popular, a lot of these are pretty close together. I figured that the premium trim and the EcoBoost trim would be two of the more popular ones. Close behind that would be the all-wheel drive trim with the standard interior and the standard V6, and then the front-wheel drive variant, being the least popular but the most affordable. As far as the engine go, we only need one factory setup because there is only one engine we're producing. We just have two variants of that engine. So we have a large factory, and I tried to balance the engines so that actually we have three different variants that we're using. We've tried to balance them so that we were producing enough engines, and it looks like I'm a little bit off with the CNA6. So it looks like if we just reduce this one a little bit, we'll get there. There we go. So we were just a little bit off. It looks like we've got it where we need it now, although we were a little bit down on the BNA6, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. So let's go ahead and move on to a comparison of the Nebula and all of the other models I have made and covered in videos so far. So the Nebula in drivability, with a couple of its stronger trims, achieves 57. Now, its standard base trim is at 55, and the turbocharged EcoBoost engine is down at 47. But as you can see with the Luna, as well as the Orbit that also uses the EcoBoost engine, as well as the Asteroid here, you do have quite a bit of a penalty when using a turbocharged engine. But as far as the drivability of some of our other trims go, our standard front-wheel drive trim is a little bit down, but it exceeds, for instance, the standard trim we have here for the Constellation. It doesn't quite perform as well as the Star here, but 57 with a couple of the trims that we were able to achieve is a number that we were achieving a lot in this year period. So I think that we were able to achieve that with a couple of our trims is a good sign. But we definitely have stronger performers in other models. For instance, the Constellation here is up to 59, as well as the Orbit with two of its trims achieving 59 as well. As far as sportiness goes, this isn't one of our stronger performers. It's not really built for that, though. And as far as comparing it, for instance, to the Orbit here, which uses pretty much the same engines except for the two trims that use the inline 4, we see definite improvements compared to the Nebula. So definitely not that strong of a performer in sportiness. Comfort-wise, again, I would say the Orbit is a good competitor, although the Orbit has that premium infotainment system on all of its trims that it's going to give it quite a bit of a boost. So it's kind of hard to compare it here. But if we compared it to, for instance, the Asteroid here, the Asteroid does pretty well with most of its trims achieving 33 or 32, whereas the Nebula has a couple trims that achieve 32, one that achieves 31. Its premium trim gets up to 45, which is better than anything the Asteroid was able to do. So the premium trim is pretty darn good. But comparing it to some other models that we have as far as comfort goes, the Star, for instance, is, I would say, close in numbers. Maybe it's slightly better there. So it's not too bad of a performer, but I would say it's middle of the road. As far as prestige goes, it seems to be a decently strong performer, 29 at best, 22 at worst, which does exceed, for instance, some of the numbers you see that the Orbit gets, but you have to consider, again, like to like, base trim to base trim. We have a little bit better prestige here with the Orbit, but again, I would say this is more middle of the road. As far as safety goes, this looks to be one of our safest models. The next best would be probably the Constellation. I think a lot of that is due to the weight, though. Practicality, though, is where this thing comes out in spades, being by far and away our best performer. Our previous champion was the Asteroid with its crew cab trims coming in at 75. Close behind that is the Orbit with 72. Now we're up to 84, which is a pretty significant improvement over our next best trim or model. Off-roadability is better than some models, but not as strong, obviously, as the Asteroid. And the Orbit comes close. We do have a couple trims here that outperform it in off-roadability, but it also comes equal to a couple or exceeds a couple of our trims. As far as utility goes, this is a decent performer, outperforming the Orbit, which is a pretty strong performer. Constellation is close. I would say we outperform it for the most part. But of course, we don't come anywhere near what the Asteroid can do, and that's because the Asteroid is all about this number right here. As far as reliability goes, I would say it's comparable to that of the Constellation. It's a little bit up in some of its trims, but a little bit down in some and other ones. So I would say comparable to Constellation, and maybe even comparable to the Star here as well, achieving either 72 or 70. Fuel economy is not too bad considering the size of the vehicle. It outperforms the Asteroid by a decent extent, although it is entirely powered by V6s and doesn't have any V8s. But it doesn't do quite as well as the Constellation, which has pretty much the same engine. So if we were to compare the premium V6 of the Constellation versus the premium V6 of the Nebula, we can see that the Constellation is better performing, even though it's the same engine. But weight-wise, the Nebula is definitely heavier. As far as emissions go, this is a pretty decent performer because it uses that EV 3.2 V6, which is pretty good as far as this goes. But because of the weight and the demands on the engine, it doesn't do as well as we see other models that use that engine do. For instance, the Orbit here does pretty well as far as emissions go comparatively. Production units wise, this is one of our more production intensive models, coming close to the Constellation here, actually exceeding it with a couple of the trims, and also close to the Asteroid. So our three most production intensive models are the Nebula, Constellation, and Asteroid. Honestly, no surprise there. Cost wise as well, it is comparable again to the Constellation. Not quite as high as the Asteroid, but we purposely inflated the price of the Asteroid, so that is the reason why it's one of the more expensive models here. In any case, that wraps up our comparison, and I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.